Without further ado, we're very fortunate to have with us Carolyn Parkinson from UCLA, who's going to talk about the brain in the social world, integrating approaches from neuroscience, psychology, and social network analysis. Carolyn.
Great, so thank you so much for having me. It's really exciting to get to be a part of such a really unique and interdisciplinary workshop full of speakers whose work I admire so much and I'm excited to hear from. So it's a real honor to get to be a part of this workshop, and thank you so much to the organizers for putting all of this together. And before I get started, I wanted to be sure to thank the many people involved in the work that I'm going to be telling you about, particularly members of my lab at UCLA and my former mentor, Talia Wheatley. Everything that I'm going to be discussing today is really a team effort. And so the work that I'm going to be telling you about today, and a lot of the work that we do in my lab in general, is focused on understanding how the brain encodes and influences and is influenced by the social networks that surround it. And there is surprisingly little known about this, and that's partially because even within the field of ostensibly social neuroscience, especially when it comes to studying things like social perception, we tend to spend our time doing things like studying isolated people, lying in noisy tubes, doing things like looking at pictures of strangers. So we tend to do things like bring people in for MRI studies where we show them generic stimulus sets. So for example, if one of the speakers that we'll hear from tomorrow, Lauren, were a participant in one of our studies, we might compare how her brain responds to the stranger smiling versus the stranger scowling. And it's rare that we take into account any real-world social relationships involving the person that the participant is seeing. And when we do, we tend to really focus on very coarse distinctions. So, for example, how does her brain respond to someone who she knows well, like, for example, her colleague Megan, who we'll also hear from tomorrow, versus someone who might not be personally familiar to her, but might be visually familiar to her, like a public figure like Justin Pradeu, for example. And these kinds of studies where we use generic stimulus sets like what I showed you on the previous slides, or look at coarse distinctions like familiar other versus stranger, can tell us a lot, and they have. So, for example, seeing a familiar face, as you might know, will engage brain regions involved in things like interpreting social cues more so than seeing a stranger would. And, of course, seeing good things happen to people you know is more rewarding than seeing good things happen to someone you don't know. But not a lot of research has really gone beyond these very general coarse distinctions like significant other versus stranger, or familiar other versus stranger. And if we just constrain ourselves to these kinds of really stripped down paradigms and coarse distinctions, we really risk missing out on a lot of the picture when we're trying to understand social thought and behavior and the neural underpinnings thereof. And so with this in mind, the work that I'm going to be focusing on today really centers on the interaction between our cognition as individuals and the webs of social relationships in which each one of us is embedded. And I think that understanding this is really, really central to understanding just a lot of facets of everyday social cognition and behavior. So you can imagine perhaps the simplest possible social interaction you might have. So maybe you're walking down the sidewalk on a given day or walking across campus and you bump into someone. How you respond to that individual, so how much attention you pay to her, if you stop to say hello, the kinds of things you might say where you stop to say hello, even things like how much you might trust this individual. These things all depend in part on aspects of this person as an individual, so maybe your knowledge of her likes and dislikes, her traits, and so on. But how you perceive and interact with her is also going to depend on your relationship with her. So, of course, it's not just characteristics of individuals in isolation that shape how we perceive and respond to them. There's also the question of our direct relationships with them. So are they a friend, a boss, an acquaintance, and so on. And then it gets more complicated even than that, of course, because we each have our own sets of social connections, who in turn are connected to each other and to others. And so we're all embedded in these networks of social relationships. And information about someone's position in our social network can matter for our behavior. So, for example, some people might be better connected than others, and so now there might be more pronounced reputation costs for doing things like divulging sensitive information or for wronging them. So you have to modulate your behavior accordingly. And some people have even argued very prominently that the cognitive demands associated with tracking and encoding and managing relationships in our social networks played a really significant role in the evolution of the human brain. And so this is arguably something that's really important to us as a species, and it's something that we seem to be concerned with a lot of the time, but it's something that we still don't seem to know very much about. So how do we understand, how do we shape, and how are we shaped by the patterns of social relations around us? And so to begin to try and answer these kinds of questions, we generally start by taking an approach that looks something like the following. So we get everybody in some bounded community, so a school or a dorm, or in some cases a small village, and we essentially ask them or characterize who their friends are, typically giving them more specific criteria than just who are your friends, but that's shorthand that fits nicely on a slide. And then using this information, we can map out the friendship network of that bounded community, which allows us to get a rich set of information about these people without really having to ask them much beyond who their friends are, and without really needing to clue them into what our subsequent studies are going to be about. And so from this information, we can glean a lot of other information. So for example, who's well-connected to well-connected others, which we'll unpack more in a few minutes. And in human social networks, this is thought to be associated with things like social status and protection from maltreatment and scapegoating, which we'll also get into in just a little bit. We can also discern who tends to bridge or broker between otherwise disparate parts of the network. So these people also tend to be social chameleons who participate in multiple different cliques and might modulate their behavior more depending on their context. You can also tell who's how many degrees of separation from everybody else in the network. So these are just a few of the kinds of information that might be behaviorally relevant to people that we can extract from this kind of data. And we can have some or all of the people from these networks come in to the lab to do behavioral and neuroimaging studies, where we can ask questions like, how much do people know about where others sit in their real-world social networks? And do our brains retrieve this knowledge when we encounter each other so that it can beneficially shape how we think and how we act, and which is thought to be the case with other kinds of social knowledge? We can also ask if how we process the world around us is related to how our social networks are organized. And also we can ask how shared understanding might emerge in social networks and how this might relate to our overall levels of social connectedness or isolation within our communities. And so I'm going to start by discussing some work within this first family of questions. And here we were specifically interested in asking, as I said, how much people know about where others sit in the real world social networks, and if our brains encode this information spontaneously when encountering others to help us gear up for appropriate and beneficial social interaction. And there's reason to think that this might be the case. So there's other aspects of our knowledge about other people, like their personality traits, for example, that are thought to be spontaneously activated when you encounter someone. And the purpose of activating this knowledge is thought to be preparing you for effective and adaptive social interaction. This allows you to sort of seemingly effortlessly shift gears depending on who you happen to find yourself around. And information about social ties, like if somebody is a friend of yours, or also things like if they're a friend of one of your friends, or characteristics of their position in the broader network, like how well connected they are. These things also likely inform our behavior and our thinking. And as I said, well, there is a fair amount known about how the brain responds to basically familiar others versus strangers, and encodes that information, relatively speaking. As I alluded to earlier, there really isn't much known about how we encode and how we're affected by specific social relationship information about familiar others. But it's important to keep in mind that these are the people, like your friends, your neighbors, your coworkers, with whom a lot of your everyday social interactions actually take place. So these finer grained distinctions within the spectrum of familiar others are arguably more important to a lot of your everyday decisions and behaviors. And so to begin to get at this, in the first study that I'll tell you about, we took all the first-year students in an academic program, so about 300 people. This is an MBA program at Overall University, and measured their social network simply by asking them to answer this survey question about who they tend to socialize with most often as part of an activity that they didn't know would be related to the fMRI study that they'd be recruited for a few weeks later. So they answered this question: consider the people with whom you like to spend your free time. Since you arrived at this institution, who are the classmates you've been with most often for informal social activities, going out to lunch, dinner, drinks, films, visiting one another's homes, and so on. And so students essentially name their friends using this kind of operationalization of friend who you've socialized with regularly, since some people might interpret it differently if we just ask for your friends. And using this information, we can map out the social network of the cohort. So here, all the circles are students, the lines are printed between them. And the properties, of course, of students' positions in such a densely connected network are pretty hard to visualize in this way, especially when showing all the students and all the connections between them. It just looks like a big, ugly hairball. So when visualizing this here, I'm just walking you through the logistics of what we did in the study rather than actually illustrating anything about what the network itself looks like or the kinds of facets of social network positions that we're interested in. And so to actually walk you through some of the key aspects of sociality that we're interested in here, I'm going to use a simpler toy network of about 13 people. And so I'm going to speak pretty generally here, since my understanding is that there's a real broad range of interests in the group today. But I'm happy to chat in more detail afterwards if anybody is interested. And so one important consideration is just social distance, right? So this is very easy to get at. It's just like playing the 6 degrees of separation game. So for any participants, like we could take Mary, we can see that she's 1 degree away from Tim, 2 degrees away from Luke. And you can play that game with everybody in the network and see how close or far they are from Mary. And you can imagine how this information might shape Mary's behavior, right? So the actions and thoughts and behaviors and feelings of people who are closer to Mary might be more relevant to her than those of people who are not directly connected to her or to her circle of friends. And so she might be more likely to attend to them and tune into them and be impacted by them. We can also extract other important pieces of information about sociality from the pattern of ties in this network too, like how well connected each person is to well connected others. And this might be especially important for humans because for us, our power to influence other people and things like conflict resolution and resource allocation, these things don't just depend on who's most physically dominant or strongest, or even who's most prestigious or who knows the most. So if you have a lot of people who support you, who in turn have others who support them, you gain a kind of social power or status. And so here we define social status in terms of how well connected you are to well connected to others, or eigenvector centrality based on incoming ties. And the people high in this measure are essentially big ponds, big fish and big ponds socially. So like Bob here, even though Bob and Tim both have 4 friends, Tim's status in this sense is lower because his friends just aren't as well connected. So similar, you might notice how Google decides like what pages to rank first when you do a web search. So just like a link coming to your web page from my web page wouldn't be as valuable to your search ranking as a link from like the New York Times or something coming to your web page. Bob's link to Leah is a lot more valuable here to his status, as we're defining it, than Tim's link to someone like Amy or Luke. And a third important aspect of sociality that we can extract from the pattern of ties in this network is who connects otherwise separate people in the network. So in other words, who occupies a minimally constrained network position. These will serve as sort of social bridges or brokers. So you can maybe think of a person like Tim here, who back in school days might have been friends with people in lots of different groups, in contrast to someone like Lisa, whose friends are already friends with each other and is in a more constrained network position. So compared to Lisa, Tim is more likely to get more diverse information, and he's also more likely to be a kind of social chameleon who adjusts his behavior to fit into the social context he happens to find himself in. We can characterize how constrained everyone is in the network. We all vary on how constrained we are, how well connected we are, and of course we're closer to some people than we are to others. And so together, these features describe a lot about our positions in our social networks. And so we can take everybody in the network that I showed you earlier and characterize them in terms of this information. And as I said before, this allows us to get a rich set of information about these individuals without having to ask them much before we bring them in for our actual in-lab study, and without having to clue them into what we're actually interested in here. We took some people from this network, so the nodes you see colored in peach here, and had them come in for this case an fMRI study. And for each fMRI participant, we can look at the network from their perspective and see, as you can see on this right side of the slide, who's 1, 2, and 3 trees away from the participant. And then we tailor-made a stimulus set for each individual that contained 12 of their cohort mates. So the 2 highest and lowest eigenvector centrality individuals at each of 3 distances from them in the network. So the 2 smallest and largest nodes in each layer here represented by these silhouettes on the left-hand side of the slide. And for each stimulus set, we had a short video of them saying essentially the same thing, which we showed to people in the scanner. So they just saw videos like this with fixation crossed in between, and then press a button whenever they saw the same person twice in a row, just to make sure that they are staying awake at the very least. And then after scanning, there was a questionnaire that probed how people perceived others' positions. And just quickly looking at that post-scan questionnaire data, so each line is a participant, perceptions are on the y-axis, and reality is on the x-axis. In all 3 graphs, you can see that these things are quite positively related. As you can see, we seem to know a fair bit about where other people fit in our social networks. But is this knowledge spontaneously retrieved when we encounter these people? And so to get at this, we used a searchlight representational similarity analysis approach, where at each point in the brain, we get the local neural response pattern to that person, and to each person that the participant saw, which is represented by these rows here. And then just compare those patterns to each other to make a neural similarity structure that just captures the distinctions that a given brain region makes. So in other words, how it organizes information essentially, what it treats as similar, what it treats as the same, or what it treats as different, and by how much. And then we can go back to the social network data and look at the 12 people from this participant stimulus set and construct similarity structures based on those 3 measures of sociality that I went through earlier. And now, because we've summarized the patterns from the brain data and the social network data in a way that's abstracted away from how we acquired this information, right? It's just 12 by 12 matrices indexed by individual in the stimulus set. We can do things like take the neural similarity structure at a given point in the brain and model it as a weighted combination of the 3 similarity structures social network data. We can do things like see what kinds of social network information might be carried in different brain regions. And so here, colors signify what seems to be encoded in given brain areas. And without getting into too much sort of wildly speculative reverse inference, some of these results point to testable hypotheses, at least, about the underlying processes that might be differentially triggered or influenced by social network positions. So, for example, information about eigenvector centrality of the person you're viewing is carried in brain regions that are associated, among other things, of course, with mentalizing or thinking about other people's thoughts. And in some newer work led by my former grad student, Miriam Schwick, shown here, we see a similar set of results when people are looking at the faces of people from fictive networks that they've just learned about. And I just mentioned that because although it's nice to get this naturalism from real-world social networks, it's also helpful to complement that, I think, with more controlled studies where we can separate people's knowledge about others' positions in a social network from other kinds of person knowledge that might co-vary with it, or from faith-based trait inferences, or personal familiarity, visual familiarity, and other visual characteristics of faces. And just the fact that social network centrality of somebody who you're encountering is encoded apparently in brain regions that are also associated with mentalizing suggests the possibility, we tested of course, but suggests the possibility that being well-connected to well-connected others might impact how you attend to others' mental states. And I'll just quickly tell you about some behavioral work that we are working on, testing this notion that was suggested to us from the neuroimaging results that I just showed you. And one very simple way to measure attention to other people's mental states is with gaze cueing paradigms. And in these paradigms, the participant's job is very, very simple. They're just asked to stare at the center of a screen and indicate whether a target, like this T here, appears on the right or the left. And the only catch is that right before a given target appears, a face appears that's either gazing to the right or to the left. And even though the direction of the face's gaze has nothing to do with where the target subsequently appears, and participants are made well aware of this, they're faster to correctly respond to the target's location when the cueing base had just been looking in the direction where the target later appeared. So in the valid trial shown up top here, compared to when the face had just been looking in the opposite direction, so in the invalid trials shown on the bottom here. And so the gaze cueing effect, you being faster to respond correctly on valid compared to invalid trials, arises because we automatically track and shift our attention towards where other people seem to be attending, so to what other people seem to be thinking. And so the strength of this effect reflects how much you're attending to the apparent mental states of the cueing phase. And so if we do actually differentially strongly attend to the apparent mental states of exceptionally well-connected others in our social networks, as those fMRI results that I just showed you might suggest, then these people's faces should exert stronger gaze cueing effects. And this is exactly what we found so far in some work where we're testing this by first here characterizing the social network of a new group, and then having as many of those people as possible come in to get photographed to make stimulus sets for a gaze cueing study where the participants are their fellow group members, shown in peach here. And I'll just quickly show you some of the key results. So the strength of the gaze cueing effect is shown on the y-axis here, and the eigenvector centrality of the cueing phase is on the x-axis. And as you can see, the faces of better connected people are exerting stronger gaze cueing effects when they're shown. And this does fit with past findings showing that social attention is modulated by other ways that researchers often operationalize social status, often through cues to physical dominance or formidability or masculinity, arguably because individuals high in those kinds of traits are more behaviorally relevant, making their mental states and behaviors really, really important to tune into and monitor and predict. And here we're seeing that social network centrality also modulates social attention, which I think makes sense given that well-connected people are especially influential when it comes to things like spreading information or shaping reputations or shaping norms. And so especially for the kinds of people that, for better or for worse, we often study in a lot of psychology and neuroscience studies. So students on college campuses, oftentimes people with largely peaceful day-to-day lives, how well connected others are might be a facet of social status that's especially behaviorally relevant. And so this is just one example of how social network knowledge, once it's retrieved by the brain, might shape downstream processing and behavior. And moving forward, we're examining other ways that social network knowledge might shape how we think and how we act, as well as how context and trait level differences might impact this. And on that note, a really talented grad student, Ruby Fasudi, recently authored a review and perspective paper synthesizing work from diverse fields that might inform our understanding of how we encode and learn and use social network knowledge and ways forward in better understanding this. And I just wanted to mention that in case anybody's interested in delving into these sorts of questions further, since I'm going through things kind of quickly in this talk. I think she did a really nice job of sort of synthesizing work that's historically been very scattered across disciplines on phenomena that are a really big part of our everyday mental life, but that we still don't know all that much about. And I think there's lots of room for informative work to be done in this space still. But pivoting a little bit now, move on to the second section of my talk. We can also use that general approach that I went over at the very beginning of my talk, where we characterize the social network of some bounded community and recruit members of that community for in-lab studies to ask how we process the world around us is related to where we sit in our social network. And so many of us have the sense that our friends are people who are like us, and that birds of a feather flock together is the thing. And many of you know that sociologists have confirmed this tendency, or Maoz, so love of the same, across really diverse contexts. For example, when it comes to things like gender and age and religion. But most of us have the sense that our friends aren't just people who just fulfill certain demographic criteria and match us up. So it's not like our friends are just people who we find because they're age, the same gender, and so on. In demographic groups, we of course resonate with some people more than others, and hopefully you have friends who fall into different demographic categories than your own. Until relatively recently, a lot of the evidence for homophily has really been centered on these very coarse variables, like, for example, demographics. And this is despite the perception that a lot of us have that our friends are people who we sort of click with, so who respond to things like we do, who see the world in a similar way to how we ourselves do. And so we want to test this notion here. And one window into how we respond to the world, into our thoughts, our emotions, and how we allocate our attention as these processes unfold is provided by neural response time series to dynamic naturalistic stimuli, like, for example, film clips. So some really elegant work by the Hassan group and others has shown that you show a group of people some engaging dynamic stimulus, like a movie, and extract time series from corresponding brain regions. As people watch that movie, they become sort of locked together in time. And the similarity of responses, depending on where you're looking, of course, and the kinds of stimuli that you're showing people, reflects things like similarities in interpretations, what people are focusing on, people's emotional reactions, and so on. And so if we are exceptionally similar to our friends in how we attend to and interpret and respond to the world, then we'd expect our neural responses to rich real-world stimuli to be exceptionally similar among people who are friends and people who are closer together in their social networks. And so to get at this, we again characterize the full friendship network of another graduate program. We had a subject come in for an fMRI study where they just watched a set of videos while we scanned them. And we had a few criteria for choosing what we showed them. We wanted participants to see things that they hadn't seen before, to avoid, for example, similarities among friends just being inflated because they'd watched the same things together before. We also wanted things that would be engaging, so hopefully they would recruit a good portion of the suite of cognitive and emotional processes that make up our everyday mental life, and of course to minimize mind wandering, which would of course be a source of noise, since two people could both be mind wandering, but mind wander about different things, and so look very different even though if they're tuning out at the same time. And hopefully this minimizes variability between people that is due to thoughts that are just unrelated to the experiment itself. But we didn't want to sort of squelch intersubject variability completely. We also wanted videos that would introduce more meaningful variability in responses, because different people might interpret them differently or attend to them differently or to different aspects of them, and maybe have different emotional responses to them. So we wanted videos that would minimize uninformative variability between people by being novel and engaging, but also promote more meaningful inter-subject variability. So it's some things that some people might find kind of sweet and touching and adorable. Others might find kind of sappy and cloying and overly sentimental. Things that might appeal to people with a certain sense of humor, but not others, might fail to appreciate or even detect, in some cases, the humor. Things that might be understood or parsed differently depending on one's knowledge and one's interests, and arguments that some people might really resonate with, that others might respond to with skepticism or even confusion. And just to give you a sense of our participants' experience in the study, I'll show you some brief excerpts of some of the kinds of things that they saw in the study. In the interest of time, each excerpt that I'll show you will just be a few seconds long each, but in the actual study, they were all a few minutes long.
Outside on the first spacewalk, dark side of the world. By having workers who only had to do things, hidden low wage, it was very easy to find someone to replace them. Water squeezes out of the cloth, and then because of the surface tension of the water, it's insulting. When a coach is making 5 to 10 to 15 times more than a college president. These babies are not strong enough to cling, and they fall to the ground repeatedly. It's a time like that you don't often think of funny things to say, but I did. And I turned to the rescue workers and I said, talk about a rough day at work. That was referring to spending the time up there being pretty rough. Talk about a rough day at work.
So again, each clip in the actual study was longer than that, a few minutes long each. That's just to give you a sense of the kinds of things that people would have seen. While participants watched the videos, we measured activity rate as it rose and fell over time. And so on top, you see data from 2 people who watched these clips. On the bottom is the stuff to be summarized for the circled brain regions. Here, it's been sped up significantly for visualization, so I don't have to linger on this slide. But you can see that at some points, at least, these people seem to be relatively in sync with one another. And these people happen to be friends. And so we wanted to test if, in general, people who are friends and people who are closer together in their social network would have more similar neural responses. And so to get at this, we did something very simple. So for each pair of fMRI participants, we just looked at their brain parts relations, where regions are defined based on underlying anatomy. And so different regions are just shown in different colors here. And then we just measured the similarity of their neural response time series and corresponding brain regions as they watched the video. And then we can go back to the social network data and see how close these people were in the social network. And then we can relate the social network proximity data to the neural response. And so here I'm just going to show you some descriptive statistics to give you a sense of the overall results. And I should note that the results that I'll be showing you are controlling for all the demographic variables that we were able to get our hands on. So here, warmer colors are going to be more similar than average for a given brain region, and cooler colors are going to be less similar than average for a given region. And so for people who are 3 degrees of separation from each other in the network, so people who are friends of friends of friends, we're seeing cooler colors throughout much of the brain, suggesting that these people are responding pretty dissimilarly to one another. Opposite seems to be true for distance 2 dyads. So here we're seeing warmer colors, suggesting that these people who are not friends with each other, but are friends with one another's friends, are responding to what they're seeing more similarly than people who are farther removed from one another in the network. And then if we look within friends, we see warmer colors, indicating that these people are responding to what they're seeing in an exceptionally similar way. I should note that the story does get more complicated when we look at the small number of people who were 4 or more degrees apart from one another in the network, and I'm happy to chat more about that with people afterwards if anyone's interested, but it's important to note. And the general pattern that we do see is more pronounced in regions that determine things like how we allocate our attention, like superior parietal lobule circled here, where friends are especially similar, and then the similarity decreases with social distance, as well as in, for example, the angular gyrus below that, where previous work from the Thong group has shown that similar neural response time series are associated with similar high-level interpretations. And in some ongoing behavioral work, we're starting to see converging evidence that people are closer together in their social networks interpret situations more similarly. For example, if I showed you a photo like this and you interpret it positively, like a man anticipating a visit from loved ones, it's likely that your friends would too, rather than, for example, somebody looking out the window because they're worried about what might be out there. And you can see in these graphs from some work in progress where behavioral response similarity is on the y-axis and social distance is on the x-axis, that we're seeing kind of a similar pattern, albeit much noisier than what we saw with the data that I showed you previously. And in some other work in progress, we're beginning to examine what kinds of similarities in processing drive the relationship between neural similarity and social network proximity in different brain regions. And so, to return to the question I started this section with, do we see the world like our friends do? It seems to be that we do tend to be surrounded by people whose brains respond to the world similarly to our own. But it is really important to note that because all the work that I've told you about this far has been cross-sectional, so we've been looking at people who are already friends with one another and looking at neural similarity amongst those people, there is this really important open question, which is, do we become friends with people who are already like us and how they respond to and perhaps see the world, or do we grow similar to and sort of align ourselves with our friends over time, and in what ways? And so to begin to try and answer these kinds of questions, we've been working on some newer longitudinal research to try and tease these things apart, which is what I'll tell you a little bit about next. So in a more recent study led by two really excellent grad students, Lisa Shen and Brian Hyun, because we wanted to look at pre-existing similarities and how people process the world around them and how those relate to future friendship and perhaps cause future friendship, we wanted to recruit people who had not yet met one another. And so we recruited people who were just about to move to a new town to start an MBA program. And the vast majority of these people were about to move into university-provided housing where their roommates and their locations would be randomly assigned, as would the study groups with whom they would complete much of their coursework. And for most of our participants, we were able to scan them within a couple of days of their arrival in town. So before they had a chance to meet many people in what would be their new home for the next year or two, much less get to know one another and substantially influence and be influenced by one another. And just like in the previous cross-sectional study that I told you about, we had people watch a variety of video stimuli while they were displaying in the MRI scanner, and we examined how brain activity fluctuated over time. And we characterized their social network 2 months later, so once they'd attended orientation and had a few weeks of classes and gotten to socialize with and know one another, and then again 6 months into. And so as I just said, at time 1 of the study, we used the same kind of paradigm that I told you about when describing the previous fMRI study, where while participants watched videos, we measured how activity across the brain rose and fell over time in various regions. And then I'll quickly tell you about what we're interested in at each time point in the data set. So first, we're interested in these pre-existing similarities in neural responding before people have had a chance to meet and potentially impact one another. And then at time 2, a couple of months later, we wanted to measure who became friends with whom, and more generally, how far apart people ended up in the social network. So did they later become friends, friends of friends, and so on? And then even later in the academic year, so 6 months in at time 3, we wanted to measure the same thing once they'd had more of a chance to get to know each other, meet more people, and form more stable friend groups. And interestingly, we don't see much of a relationship between pre-existing neural similarity measured before meeting one another and subsequent friendship and social distance more broadly when we just look at that initial social network data. So in the friendships that first formed 2 months into the school year. But when we look at what happens once you've had more of a chance to get to know one another and meet more people and perhaps sort out who they might be compatible with, So 6 months after they first arrived on campus, we see a pretty clear relationship that looks like this. And so we see that in many regions of the brain, for example, in many regions of the default mood network that are associated with like memory and suggestive control and social cognition, and also in regions that determine things like how we allocate our attention. There's this exceptional similarity among the people who later go on to become friends 6 months later, but less so among people who later end up 2 degrees apart in the network, so friends of friends, and far less among people who end up 3 degrees apart in the network. So here we're seeing that similarity in how our brains respond to the world around us, collected before people even meet each other, is linked to whether or not people end up becoming friends in the future, and how socially close those people end up becoming after several months have passed and people have had the chance to meet lots of people, get to know one another, and presumably figure out who they kind of click with. But we were also sort of wondering about the changes that seem to happen between times 2 and times 2 and 3. So when we enter community, many of the initial social partners that we have are due, in many cases, to kind of external factors like circumstance and who you happen to sit beside, for example, in a class, who you happen to be put in a group with at an orientation event, who your roommate happens to be, and so on. And some of those people you end up staying friends with, but other people you end up drifting apart from. And similarly, as time goes on, we get the chance to encounter more people who we didn't first get the chance to meet, who might share the same tastes as us, share the same senses of humor as us, maybe even knowledge and priors about the world and how they interpret it, and so on. And so next we want to test if neural similarity measured before these people meet each other predicts these sorts of phenomena. So in other words, how the friendship network changes over time. And so to answer this question, we looked at what changed and how, and what stayed the same between time 2 and time 3. And so we looked separately at the dyads that grew closer from 2 to 6 months into the academic year, the dyads that drifted farther apart, and those that stayed the same in terms of social distance. And when we do this, we see a pattern of results like showing here, where the pairs of people who grew closer in social ties after several months had passed are people whose neural responses were initially quite similar to one another, even before they met one another, reflected in the warmer colors that you're seeing here. And people who ended up drifting farther apart as time passed are people whose brains initially responded to what we showed them very, very different ways, reflected in the more in the cooler colors that sort of pervade the image there. And people whose social distances didn't change over time are kind of somewhere in the middle here. And if we directly compare the people who grew further apart versus those who grew closer together in the network over time, we see some interesting differences. So in this image, unlike the one that I was showing you before, the colors indicate the mean difference in dyadic similarities between the two groups. So the dyads that grew closer over time versus the dyads that grew farther apart. And any cool colors, which you really don't see much of in this image, would mean that there was greater similarity amongst people who ended up drifting farther apart compared to people who grew closer together in social ties as the school year went on. And warmer colors, which really dominate here, convey the opposite. So warmer colors mean that people who grew closer over time are people who were already more similar to one another before they even met than those who ended up drifting farther apart. And areas where this contrast is significant are outlined in black here. And you can see again that this includes regions involved in things like subjective control and memory, and also attentional allocation, and perhaps as a result of that, areas involved in visual processing. So here we're seeing that similarity in how your brain responds to the world around you predicts not only who your friends are right now, but who your friends are going to be in the future, and how your closeness to others is going to shift over time. And so to return to that question that I started this section with, we are seeing some evidence that similarity in how our brain processes the world around us might be a cause of friendship and a cause of becoming closer together over time. Since your neural responses measured before meeting predicts who you're likely to become close to in the future, particularly once significant time has passed and you have a chance to get to know those around you well and sort out who you might be compatible with. And we're still working on data collection aimed at testing if and in what ways we sort of align ourselves with and grow similar to our friends over time, as it's likely that both factors are at play, but we need some additional fMRI data before we can examine that other side of the coin. And just briefly, so the studies I described in the second section of my talk really focused on the relationship between dyadic social distance and interpersonal similarity. And in some new work that I'll just very briefly touch on before wrapping up, we've been looking at how shared understanding with others in one's community relates to our overall sense of social connection or disconnection, as well as how we might build and reinforce shared understanding with those around us. And this work is led by a really talented former postdoc in my lab, Alyssa Beck, who recently started her own lab at USC and is doing some great follow-up work there. And so this work used similar methods to what I went over in the past few studies. So I'll just skip over this since I think I'm nearing the end of my time. And here we assessed people's overall sense of social connection, which here we operationalized as the number of friends they had in the community, and found that the people who are particularly objectively well connected, so popular in their social networks, so people who many others nominated as a friend, people high in degree centrality, those people were individuals who processed the world in a way that was particularly reflective of norms in their communities. And this was true even when taking into account their friendships with each other and their distances to each other in the network. We saw this in a variety of brain regions, including, for example, the medial prefrontal cortex, as you see here, where warmer colors depict areas where having more similar neural responses among was prominent among people who are better connected in the community, and cooler colors, which again you don't see much of in this image, would depict more similar responses among people who were less connected. And this is the same phenomenon just shown another way, where the students in two wings of a dorm are depicted as circles with the sides indicating the number of friends the person had, and the color indicates how similar someone's neural responses in the MPFC region highlighted there, were to the rest of the people in their wing of the dorm. And there you can see that there's darker orange among many of the larger nodes, such as some of those in the center there, indicating more normative responding in those people, and lighter orange and more yellow in some of the smaller nodes, like some of those along the periphery there, indicating more idiosyncratic responding in those, suggesting that people who are particularly well connected in their communities may process the world in a way that helps them to connect with others in that community and maybe share more common ground with them. And interestingly, we're seeing similar separate effects of similarity to one's peers in neural responses to videos on measures of subjective social disconnection, so one's level of loneliness, as you see here. So as you know, our sense of social disconnection or connection doesn't just depend on how many people we socialize with. Some people might feel totally socially fulfilled just with one or two friends. Others might feel really lonely even when they're in a crowded room or just consistently socializing with lots of different people. And even when accounting for people's social distance to others and the network and their overall objective levels of social connection, so how many friends they have or how many people they socialize with regularly, in other words, loneliness is associated with more idiosyncratic neural responding or less similarity with others in one's surroundings, indicated by the pervasive cool colors here, again with significant effects outlined in black. And so what this suggests is that you're surrounded by others who see the world really differently from how you yourself do, even if you regularly socialize with them and even if you're friends with them, you might be at risk for feeling socially disconnected or lonely. And this also suggests that the subjective feeling of being misunderstood that often accompanies the experience of loneliness. So often people who are experiencing loneliness will report feeling that others just don't understand them or not on the same wavelength as them. Those feelings might not just stem from exaggerations or misperceptions regarding others' dissimilarity to themselves. Instead, lonely people really do seem to process the world in a way that diverges from those around them. And so to just quickly zoom out and sum up, hopefully what I've shown you today is that people have pretty accurate knowledge about where other people sit in their real-world social networks. We seem to retrieve this knowledge when we encounter people, and consistent with the notion that the key reason that we spontaneously retrieve any kind of person knowledge at all when we encounter somebody is to prepare us to act in an appropriate and beneficial way. Social network centrality seems to gate social attention, so we pay more attention to what better connected people seem to be thinking about. And we seem to be exceptionally similar to people who are close to us in social ties with respect to how we respond to the world around us. And relatedly, idiosyncratic responding compared to the other people around oneself is associated with both objective and subjective social disconnection. And so just in general, I think that by combining these sorts of traditionally siloed approaches for studying patterns of social ties on the one hand with social network analysis and studying individual cognition on the other with psychology and neuroscience, we can open up what I think are a lot of interesting questions, because even when we're just looking at one person perceiving something or two people having a conversation, we really want to understand social thought and behavior. We can't just see people as isolated units and expect that we're always going to be able to tell the whole story. Even when we're just looking at an individual, or even when we're just looking at a dyadic interaction, what's really going on under the hood, so how people are perceiving and reacting to each other, and how they're influencing and being influenced by each other, often seems to take into account the broader social networks in which each one of us is embedded. And so thanks so much for your time and attention, and I'd love to take any questions in this time that we have left.
Okay, we have about 10 minutes for questions. Use your mic, please.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for this highly engaging talk. I think we all have very similar brain responses now. So I'm really fascinated by this way that you're looking at similarity across how people are processing these different social videos and so on, but also in the kind of shift of which regions appear to be responsible depending on how you're going about asking the question. So in a lot of the studies that you're showing, it seems like, as you said, the visual cortex, the occipital, and maybe parietal regions that deploy attention and respond to earlier visual stimuli are kind of driving those similarities, and there doesn't seem to be a whole lot in PFC. In a couple of them, like the one that's predictive of 2 months versus 6 months, it looked like maybe that was more occipital, but then if you looked at just predictions of who's going to become your friend later, that the red region was more frontal. So I'm wondering if you could kind of summarize how we should be thinking about whether this is about I'm looking at the same spot in the image because I have this top-down kind of similarity in what I'm interested in those occipital and parietal regions, or how much of this is really more like semantic similarities in the way that people are processing this information, and how that interacts with this shifting of which regions seem to be driving the similarity metrics.
Yeah, that's a great question. So there is, some variability across studies in some cases between analyses within a study in the regions in which we see significant results after doing multiple comparison correction. I think some of that has to do with differences in the stimuli across studies. So as you might imagine, the kinds of mental processes that might be entrained, or that might even vary in the extent to which they're entrained as a function of social distance, will really vary across people, or rather across stimuli. And it's really, in some cases, in all cases, I would say, difficult to optimize the stimulus set for these sorts of naturalistic neuroimaging studies, because it's hard to get at reliability, because it's like qualitatively different to watch the same movie twice in rows. Some of the stimuli that evoke like the most synchrony are things like Hitchcock films, because he's so masterful at manipulating people's attention and controlling their expectations. But once you've seen something, it's quite different to watch it a second time. And so there's, I think, still a lot of messiness and just variability inherent to having different stimuli in different studies, but then also more specific to the kinds of questions we're asking here. I think that even if you were to show the same stimuli to two different studies of this sort, where you're looking at different populations, the kinds of similarities that might be predictive might differ across populations. Like, so in some work, we're looking at college students, in other cases, we're looking at older adults, in some cases, we're looking at different cultures, like in like a village in South Korea, and like the kinds of cognitive similarities or affective similarities that might be related to who you end up being friends with, or even the extent to which certain things matter, might vary across populations. With respect to the specific case you mentioned in the longitudinal study, where we see some differences in the areas that appear when we're looking at changes over time versus just predicting friendship and social distance 6 months in. I guess if we lower the threshold for that prediction of friendship 6 months in, the results look quite similar, so I'm not sure how much to read into the differences there. But certainly there are significant differences across studies, and it's something we're still just beginning to understand, especially because you can see a lot of the sub-threshold results seem to be pretty like diffuse and like a similar pattern across much of the brain, but not always getting a high degree of specificity.
Great, thanks. I'd love to follow up about like some maybe multivariate ways that we could ask similar questions. It'd be very cool.
Yeah,
Thanks.
we've also looked at looking at how patterns, like the multivariable patterns change over time, and like how much people sort of stay in the same state or transition between them. And you see pretty similar results.
Cool, thanks.
I guess I need a microphone. So two different questions. One, for the many results that you've shown, it was hard for me to understand the magnitude of the effect, the effect size. For example, when you say that and that happens before people really join the crowd, then predicts. So how well does it predict? What's like R square or something? How well it would predict? That's, I guess, my first question.
I do remember the R squared offhand. For the first study, like the prediction of friendship, like we're trying to predict 4 different social distance categories, like 60% or so accuracy, which is like, I would even want to make a prescriptive decision based on it. It's like better than chance, but certainly, fMRI is quite noisy, and there are other factors that determine things like friendship as well. And yeah, but I don't remember the R squared offhand for the longitudinal study.
So I guess I have a second question. When you showed that loneliness plot, it reminded me of the first line from Anna Karenina, right, like how all happy families are happy in a similar way, but the unhappy ones. So I was then wondering whether is it that the quote-unquote lonely people really, are they each one lonely in their own way, or
yeah, actually it is. So the Sal's analyses that we performed there sort of to look for an anecdote in a Sal's effect, where like the first line of the novel is like something like, all happy families are alike, each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. And we do see, like, for example, if you compare dyads who are both low in loneliness versus both high in loneliness, you see much more similarity among the the opposite of that, where lonely people are more variable. And also if we just take, for example, the minimum within a dyad, like the minimum loneliness score, if there's at least one lonely person in a dyad, essentially, the inter-subject correlation is very low. So you essentially, it's what you were predicting, that the people who feel lonely are all kind of different from one another. They're not like it's not the case that all of the lonely people look similar to one another and all of the people who do not feel lonely.
Thank you. So I guess Tolstoy was right, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
I have one, yeah, okay.
Jake.
No, go ahead.
Am I close enough? Oh, okay, great. For the gaze cueing effects that you showed, you only showed the effect of centrality. Did you also find effect or not find an effect for social distance? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question. So right now we're trying to run a study to look at that. In that particular study, we constructed the stimulus set to kind of optimize our ability to detect an effect based on centrality. So each participant had faces that were like high and medium and low centrality, essentially. But we didn't systematically vary distance in that study, and I think there weren't enough people. I guess the stimulus that we collected didn't lend itself to being able to look at that, but it's something we're really interested in right now in investigating. So right now we're collecting data for studies to try to get at that and also look at how traits of the perceiver impact the magnitude of the effect and how attuned people are to this sort of effect as well.
Very cool. Just one quick follow-up. Very cool, really interested to see what happens from that. Do you expect there would also be some effect of the emotion showed on the face? You showed some in a different part, comparing like positive versus like negative affect.
Yeah, other people have looked at some of those results. We haven't looked like crossed with social relationship information, but it's very possible you would. We asked everyone to have like a neutral facial expression in the stimulus set, and we get ratings from third-party raters on like facial trustworthiness and dominance in order to try and control for those face-based trait inferences that others have shown have a significant effect on like many aspects of social cognition and affective processing. So we have that, which probably would be affected by the subtle expressions that people are making, but we haven't like varied the facial expressions that people are making. Thanks.
That was absolutely fascinating. Thank you, John.